He left me on our wedding night. Said I wasn't the bride he wanted, just the one he needed, for the paperwork. I had never seen a sky that beautiful, nor worn white so well, yet he didn't touch me once. Not my hand, not my lips, not even a glance long enough to be called love. The wedding suite smelled of roses and luxury soap, everything soft and white and expensive, the kind of beauty that distracts you from what isn't there, like the groom, like the future, like the part of your soul that still believes love can be enough. He said he needed to step out, just a quick call to his brother, and that's how I remember it starting, not with a scream or a slammed door, but a whisper so casual it felt rehearsed. He left, and I stayed, waiting on the edge of our marital bed, watching time bruise itself against silence. The champagne sat in its silver cradle, sweating quietly beside the strawberries we never touched, while my wedding dress clung to my body like a second skin I couldn't peel off, stiff with starch and expectation. I didn't cry, not at first, because there was no shape to what I was feeling, just this expanding silence that devoured everything around it. Hours passed. I stopped counting. Somewhere between midnight and morning, a knock came, not him, never him, just his best man, eyes bloodshot and voice cracking, handing me a folded note like it was some kind of mercy. I opened it with fingers that had worn his ring just 10 hours earlier, and I read the words that ended a marriage before it even began. I'm sorry. I can't do this. It wasn't supposed to go this far. There was no apology for the lie, for the spectacle, for the vows he made with hands that didn't shake, just the cowardice of a man who vanished before the ink on our license dried. He didn't run because he was afraid to love me, he ran because he'd finished using me, and like everything he used, I was meant to disappear. People whispered that he had cold feet, that maybe he realized too late he wasn't ready, but I wasn't interested in the story that made him sound human, because the truth wasn't romantic, it was calculated. He hadn't stumbled into this. He had planned it with the precision of a thief who knows exactly how long it takes to steal something and vanish before the alarms go off. The more I traced the timeline, the clearer it became. I wasn't his bride. I was a legal detour, a necessary transaction, a buffer between him and whatever storm he was fleeing. I found the prenup in his garment bag, tucked between the dry cleaning tags and cologne samples, and the moment I touched it, I understood. I hadn't married a man, I had signed a contract to become collateral. It wasn't just that it protected him, it buried me. I was tied to assets I hadn't known about, investments made in my name, purchases linked to accounts I'd never opened, and every clause read like a trapdoor. The only way to survive was to play dumb, pretend I hadn't noticed, and quietly begin unthreading the lie from the inside out. It was never about me. I was the front, clean, smiling, disposable, the kind of woman who could soften the edge of a man who needed to appear stable for a season. He had done this before. Not with me, not exactly, but the pattern lived in the paperwork, in the signatures filed under names that didn't match, in the houses bought and sold within months of a ceremony, in the legal trails that started and ended with a different woman each time. I wasn't special. I was next. And what he didn't realize is that I don't stay broken. I didn't call the police. I didn't alert the media or trash the hotel suite in some spectacle of rage. I walked out the front door in my wedding gown, barefoot and smiling, because there's something terrifying about a woman who has nothing left to protect. I took the prenup, the note, the untouched ring box, and I began to document everything, not to destroy him, but to dismantle the story he'd crafted so carefully. There's a difference. Destruction is loud and reckless. Dismantling is patient. Strategic. You take one brick out at a time until the whole thing caves. So while he flew off into whatever new lie he'd crafted, I changed my name, my number, my hair, and quietly started calling people he didn't think I could find. Bankers. Lawyers. The woman who notarized our prenup. I didn't ask questions. I asked for records. And what I found wasn't just a man running, it was a man hiding. From lawsuits. From tax authorities. From women with stories far worse than mine. But that's not what fueled me. What fueled me was this. He thought he got away with it. He thought the girl in the white dress would stay quiet. He was wrong. He left me on our wedding night like I was the mistake. What he didn't know was I don't stay broken. And what comes next isn't forgiveness. If you're still here, it's because you're just like me. You're not scared of the dark. You're waiting to understand it. Subscribe. Stay with me. The story only gets colder. I didn't start digging because I wanted revenge. I started because curiosity is a kind of hunger, and mine had teeth. In the days after he disappeared, I walked through life like a placeholder version of myself, smiling when people asked questions, nodding through their pity, pretending that being left on my wedding night was a tragedy I would recover from, instead of what it actually was, the beginning of something much worse. It wasn't heartbreak that kept me up at night. It was paperwork, trail markers, names that didn't belong to him, but were signed in his hand. His credit history was like a mosaic, beautiful at a distance, fractured up close, built from pieces of different lives stitched together with just enough legitimacy to avoid suspicion. The prenup I'd found wasn't his first. It was his fourth. All of them filed under slightly different names, with addresses that traced across the country like a road trip through broken vows and unfinished bank statements. None of the marriages lasted longer than 6 months. None of the women ever came forward. They disappeared like bad investments, filed under losses, never under consequences. It didn't take much to find the others, just a few hours and a prepaid background check, a small cost for the kind of clarity I was after. There was Lillian from Nevada, who vanished 2 weeks after their elopement and was later listed as a co-owner on a shell company that collapsed mid-audit. Then Angela from Houston, whose name still lingered on a deed for a rental property in Tampa. And one I couldn't quite identify, just a blurry license photo in a marriage database, filed under a name that didn't show up anywhere else. Ghost brides. Paper wives. Scars with signatures. He never stayed long enough to settle. Just long enough to marry, open accounts, shift money, buy something big and liquidate it fast, then leave before the ink dried. And somehow it worked, because people like him don't get questioned, they get congratulated. Charming men with good hair and tailored suits walk through airports and courthouses like they belong there, and no one stops them because they smile the right way and never raise their voice. He didn't need to be violent. He had paperwork. He had women like me. He had just enough honesty to camouflage the lie. And yet, none of it made sense until I found her, the one woman who didn't vanish, who didn't settle, who didn't die on paper. She was his first wife, legally speaking. But more than that, she was his partner. The one who helped him build the lie from the inside. She had a different name now, but her face hadn't changed. I found her posing in a vineyard outside Santa Barbara, arm linked through as in a photo that looked like love but read like laundering. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Their posture was too perfect. Their timeline was off. She was the one who taught him how to bury money under wedding rings. I could see it in the structure, in the way the businesses were set up to fail just after transferring equity, how the credit lines opened in the wife's name always ended up maxed and abandoned, how every luxury was rented, never owned. She was the blueprint. He was just the performance. And I was supposed to be the last one, the final, clean name to sweep the past away. What he didn't expect, what neither of them expected, was that I'd come from a family of auditors. My uncle built his career hunting men like this, white-collar ghosts who used charm and paperwork to disappear just before the lawsuits hit. I never listened when he talked about it over Thanksgiving dinner, thought his stories were too dramatic, too dark, too bitter to be real. But now I understood exactly what he meant when he said, "The biggest criminals don't wear masks, they wear wedding bands." So I reached out, showed him the prenup, and waited while his silence stretched into something dangerous. Then he said, "You're not his victim, not yet. But you're close." That's when we started building the file. Not for the police, not for the tabloids, but for leverage. Because if there's one thing paper marriages teach you, it's that truth means nothing unless it's weaponized. We pulled property records, offshore accounts, tax filings, fake LLCs, passport stamps that didn't match his name. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, let them think I'd disappeared into grief like all the others. But I was documenting everything, every lie, every purchase, every alias, because I didn't want to stop them. I wanted to walk into their next wedding and light a match under the altar. Her name was Rebecca, but on paper, she'd been Madison, Elise, Claire, and once, just R. She slipped through aliases the way rich girls slip through continents, one identity at a time, each one tailored, legally ambiguous, polished just enough to pass inspection. I found her tucked inside a gallery post from a Napa wedding planner, her hand resting on the chest of the man who left me, both of them looking like they'd earned the world. And the worst part wasn't that she was beautiful. It was that she looked familiar, not to me, but to every version of him he'd ever sold. She was the woman he referenced, but never named, the ex he always described as unstable, dramatic, jealous. The one who made him cautious and taught him to protect himself, the reason for the prenup, the whisper behind every half-truth he'd ever told me. And now here she was, smiling in designer heels, wearing a diamond so large it probably held secrets. I clicked through her social media trail and found a digital graveyard of bridesmaids, brunches, nonprofits, and soft-filtered luxury, all curated, all clean, but I knew how to read between images now, and she reeked of control. They weren't in love. That was never the point. They were in business, and I had been their latest employee. The marriage wasn't a con, it was a contract. I offered legal access, a clean record, a new starting point for assets that couldn't be traced back to her. They'd moved money through me the way water moves through a pipe, quick, quiet, and hard to follow. The bank accounts matched the timeline. I had receipts, transfers, silent partnerships that started weeks before our engagement and disappeared the morning after the wedding. It was elegant, deliberate, surgical. I was just the signature. But what they didn't know, what they never accounted for, was how much of myself I'd buried in silence, how much sharper I became when left alone with nothing but questions and a printer. By the time I confirmed the LLC she founded in Belize, I already had enough to file a civil suit. By the time I traced her back to 2 previous bankruptcies under different names, I had 3 lawyers circling. And still, I said nothing, did nothing, waited like still water, because this wasn't about restitution anymore. This was about collapse, and collapse has to be timed perfectly. I booked a seat at their engagement party under a fake name, one of her forgotten aliases, actually, and watched her speech from the second row. She thanked him for saving her, for showing her what stability meant, for teaching her how to love again. The irony was suffocating, because the same speech, almost word for word, had been fed to me in a rooftop bar in downtown Chicago, 2 years earlier, under the same moon, wearing a different ring. He wasn't charming, he was scripted. She wasn't special, she was strategic. And I was the one who remembered the lines. They weren't counting on that. They weren't counting on someone who paid attention. Most people move on. Most people delete the photos, cry in therapy, write forgiveness letters, and surrender the fantasy. But I didn't want closure. I wanted precision. So I started calling vendors, confirming deposits, tracking shipments, identifying their guest list. The same officiant who married me had been booked again. The same band. The same wine distributor. They weren't just recycling lies, they were recycling my wedding. And if that sounds absurd, remember this. People who repeat a scam don't waste time reinventing it, they just change the lighting. That's when it hit me, they were laundering more than money. They were laundering history. Each wedding was a reboot, a soft relaunch, a polished do-over meant to scrub away whatever went wrong the time before. And if no one speaks up, if every woman vanishes into her shame, then the illusion stays intact. But I didn't vanish. I evolved. I stopped asking why and started asking how much. And the number I landed on, the money, the debt, the mortgages shifted through stolen surnames, was just enough to put them on a watch list. Just enough to attract attention that couldn't be bribed away. So I sent a single email. No threats, no accusations. Just a scanned copy of my marriage license, her old identity, and 3 flagged tax documents. The rest would take care of itself. I wasn't going to stop their wedding. I was going to frame it, set the stage, dim the lights, and let them say I do under the weight of an open investigation. Because this time, when they toasted their fake forever, it wouldn't be champagne in their glasses. It would be kerosene. And all I had to do was wait for the match. The venue was draped in gold and gilt, a vineyard estate curated for legacy photos and whispered envy, the kind of place you book when you want your lies to wear tuxedos. Their names were printed in rose gold calligraphy on every napkin, every wine bottle, every menu card, though neither of them had earned the paper it was printed on. Guests arrived in silk and secrets, sipping champagne with the kind of fake joy only money can sponsor, and no one noticed the woman in the red dress seated at the far end of the terrace, because they'd trained themselves not to. I didn't need to hide. That was the luxury of being dismissed, erased, forgotten. You can walk straight through the front door and no one will stop you, because they've already rewritten you out of the story. I signed the guest book using the last name she abandoned 3 husbands ago, and the look on her face when she saw it, half smile, half ghost, was worth every hour I'd spent building the trap. She blinked once, then turned her back, too proud to flinch in public, too vain to admit what that signature meant. But I knew. And so did she. I wasn't there to scream or cry or make a scene. That's not how you dismantle people like them. They feed off chaos. They expect the ex to wail and claw and ruin the photos. They've rehearsed their pity. They've practiced their rebuttals. But what they don't expect is stillness, elegance, evidence. I walked past the gift table and placed a single envelope among the designer bags and Tiffany boxes. Inside was a USB drive, formatted with documents from 4 different countries, 10 bank statements, and 5 marriage certificates. I didn't need an audience. I just needed their officiant to open it. He was the same one who married me, a rented reverend, legally ordained through a website, flown in from Denver because he was cheap and forgettable. But I hadn't forgotten him. He had a tendency to skim paperwork and never question the names as long as the check cleared. What he didn't know was that today's ceremony included at least 2 counts of perjury and 1 count of marriage fraud. I made sure the documents were addressed to his name, with a cover letter from a firm that didn't exist, but sounded threatening enough to make him read every word, twice. They walked down the aisle like royalty, hand in hand, with the confidence of people who think they've outrun the truth. Her dress was almost identical to mine, different fabric, same silhouette, as if even her bridal identity had to be borrowed. His smile was tighter than usual, probably from the way I'd watched him all night, not with longing, but with calculation. He kept glancing toward me, expecting drama, expecting breakdown. But I just sipped my drink and smiled, because he hadn't figured it out yet. He still thought I was there to ruin something. He didn't realize it was already ruined. The officiant's voice cracked halfway through the vows. He looked at them, then down at the envelope in his hand, then back up. I could see the confusion spreading across his face, the panic blooming in his throat. But he kept going. Of course he did. That's what people like him do. They follow scripts even as the stage burns. When it was time to pronounce them husband and wife, I stood, not loudly, not dramatically, just stood, slowly, and raised my glass. The photographer turned instinctively. The officiant froze. And then she saw the USB flash drive in his hand, and everything shattered. She grabbed it, whispered something sharp, dragged him behind the altar under the pretense of a private prayer, but I saw the way their faces collapsed when they realized what I'd given them wasn't a threat, but a record. A record of every lie, every alias, every dollar they'd moved using stolen names and quiet women. It wasn't public yet, but it would be, and they knew it. The officiant walked off stage. The guests started murmuring. And I finished my drink, left my empty glass on the seat cushion, and walked out before the screaming started. I didn't look back. There was no applause, no confrontation, no satisfaction you could frame on a wall. Just the echo of silence behind me, the kind of silence that follows a detonation you don't see, only feel. They wanted a wedding to clean their history, to write over the past with golden ink and designer smiles. But they picked the wrong woman to bury. And now every toast they make will taste like ash. Every photo will hold a shadow. Every vow they repeat will echo against a truth they can't erase. And that is how a real ending begins. The footage didn't go viral, it went surgical, sent not to the world, but to the right people, the ones who mattered, the ones whose opinions couldn't be bought with cocktails and curated smiles. The officiant never finished the ceremony. He left the vineyard with shaking hands and a promise not to get involved, but involvement was never optional, not when he'd officiated 4 of their marriages under different names, not when he'd ignored every inconsistency for a fee. By sundown, 2 of their guests had called attorneys, and 1 had quietly stepped away from their joint real estate deal. I hadn't leaked anything publicly because public spectacle makes people sympathetic, and they didn't deserve sympathy. They deserved consequences, slow and compounding, like interest on a loan you forgot you signed. The photos from the wedding surfaced anyway, but they looked off, smiles too tense, angles too stiff, eyes watching something just beyond the frame. In every shot, there I was, seated calmly in red silk, framed by their collapse. They couldn't crop me out without unraveling the story. They couldn't pretend it didn't happen, because even silence leaves fingerprints. And those guests? They talked. People always do. The fallout wasn't loud. It was clinical. Vendors pulled their sponsorship. A silent investor canceled a six-figure property launch. An anonymous tip hit the IRS inquiry line. Suddenly, their names were on hold lists instead of guest lists. He lost his travel credentials over a flagged passport application. She found 3 accounts frozen with no warning. They didn't scream. They sued. Or tried to. Cease and desist letters arrived in elegant envelopes, threats wrapped in legalese, demanding I return stolen documents and withdraw maliciously false claims. But nothing I shared was false, and nothing I kept was stolen. Everything had been signed. They called it slander, defamation, harassment. But the words couldn't stick, not when every accusation was pinned to a record with signatures, timestamps, tax IDs. I never had to argue. I just kept forwarding the paper trail, one line at a time. Each reply they sent only proved the point further. Every lawyer they hired had to Google them twice. Every court they threatened to enter found contradictory filings. You can't erase truth when it's notarized. You cannot run a story when the ending's already been mailed to your lenders, your neighbors, your board members. I never raised my voice. I just raised the mirror. Their reputations didn't explode, they eroded. One social circle at a time. One black tie invitation that never came. One whispered conversation that paused when they entered a room. No scandal to deny. Just a slow, collective exhale of people realizing they'd been sold a performance and no longer buying the sequel. He tried to go quiet, claimed spiritual healing, stepped away from entrepreneurship, started speaking in vague metaphors about self-growth. She pivoted to philanthropy, posed in white blouses holding up signs about women's empowerment, as if the word wife wasn't still bleeding at the root of everything she'd corrupted. But money has memory, and so does paper. Every false address, every forged document, every name they buried under shell corporations, they'd worked so hard to disappear inside new identities, and now every one of them was visible, documented, admissible. And that's the word that broke them, admissible. Because when you turn your life into a series of contracts, every misstep becomes evidence. Every vow they exchanged at that altar? Recorded. Played back. Entered into proceedings not as romance, but as premeditation. And when their accountant was subpoenaed, he flipped fast. Loyalty doesn't stretch as far as an audit. Their lawyer contacted me with a settlement offer. A hefty one. Confidentiality, withdrawal of complaints, full silence. The kind of offer meant to pacify, to restore the illusion. But silence was never the goal. I didn't want their money. I wanted their erasure. I wanted them to taste the part of me they tried to gut, the part that waited in a hotel room wearing white, holding a future that was never mine to begin with. So I declined. Politely. Thoroughly. And included an addendum. The IRS had already been contacted. The damage was done. And the next phase was already in motion. Because this wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. And reckoning has no taste for theatrics. It walks in dressed in red, sits quietly in the front row, and never looks away. I wasn't trying to ruin their new marriage. I was making sure there wouldn't be another. No more names. No more contracts. No more foundations built on the soft backs of women who don't scream in time. They'd left me on my wedding night to disappear into a better version of themselves. But I stayed. And I waited. And I watched. And now, every vow they make echoes through a courtroom. I didn't celebrate when the news broke. I just sat in my kitchen, pouring coffee into a chipped mug, reading the headline that confirmed what I already knew. Serial marriage fraud duo under federal investigation. No photos, no dramatics, just a quiet confirmation that the truth had finally outlived the lie. Their faces pixelated under shadows, their names tied to the words unregistered assets, federal charges, and sealed depositions. They weren't infamous. They were exposed. And the only thing louder than their fall was the silence in the room they once expected me to disappear into. People think closure comes like applause, that it's loud and affirming, that it validates the pain, but real closure is quiet, dull, anticlimactic. It arrives like a letter, folded once, stamped with a name you no longer flinch at. I didn't need them arrested. I needed them documented. And now, every time they apply for a loan, attempt a lease, board a flight, their names will ring the same bell. Flagged. That's the justice people don't understand. You don't need to destroy someone to ruin them. You just make sure the truth follows them further than their lies ever could. There was no trial yet, but there were depositions. Investigations, frozen accounts. Friends who stopped returning calls. A mother who issued a public statement disowning them both. He tried to call me once, left a voicemail with a new voice, calm and trembling, asking for forgiveness, as if that word could do what 5 wives and 2 continents could not. I never answered. Not because I was angry, but because I had nothing left to say. Some betrayals don't deserve dialogue. They deserve silence that stretches long enough to become legacy. I moved just far enough to change the view outside my window. Sold the dress for scraps, donated the ring to a shelter. My name was clean again. The banks confirmed it. The state confirmed it. The trauma, though, that doesn't vanish with a letterhead. It lingers in quieter ways, in the hesitation before trust, in the pause before saying I do, in the way I walk into a room and check for exits. But it also makes you sharper, quicker. A woman who has survived strategic erasure does not fear loneliness. She fears forgetting who she became inside the wreckage. Because I did become someone else. Not colder, not harder, just exact. I learned how to ask the right questions. How to read between silences. How to trace the pattern in a man's hands when he signs something too quickly. I still date sometimes. But I don't look for love the way I used to. I look for alignment. For steadiness. For presence. Not promises. Not poetry. Not performances wrapped in tuxedos. That kind of love is for women who've never had to testify against a man who once kissed them with purpose. I have. And it changes the way you breathe. They didn't go to jail, not yet, but they lost the currency they valued most, credibility. No bank would touch them, no investor would call back, and every room they entered thinned the second their names surfaced. She took down her blog after 3 weeks of silence. He started posting about mental clarity on burner accounts. But their world shrank. Invitations stopped arriving. Their wedding photos disappeared. The only thing left of them was the paper trail I built, and a silence too heavy to outlive. So no, I didn't win. I didn't get some cinematic moment of public humiliation or a courtroom confession with tears and cameras. What I got was better. I got my name back, my future back. I got to live in a version of myself that doesn't need to scream to be heard. That's what they never understood. You can't silence a woman who's been erased and still found herself. She becomes something else. Something quieter. Sharper. Slower to trust, but impossible to fool. She becomes the woman who stayed standing when everyone expected her to collapse. And that woman? She's the one writing this. Not for sympathy. Not for pity. But as a warning and a witness. If you're listening to this and your gut has gone quiet, if the man in front of you is too perfect, too polished, too rehearsed, ask yourself one thing. If the lights went out tonight and you were left in white, what would he take with him when he left? And if you already know the answer, then darling, don't wait for closure. Go build your own ending. Light it with silence. Frame it in truth and walk out wearing red. They left me to vanish. Instead, I documented everything. You've heard the truth. You've seen what silence can build. If you felt seen in any line of the story, then don't just scroll, please subscribe. Because out here, we don't chase closure. We narrate survival. And the next letter? It might be yours.